fostering lasting peace. As the Central African Republic enters a new phase of consolidation, it is important that the progress achieved in recent years be preserved and further strengthened. And in this regard, the ongoing reconfiguration of MINUSCA should be guided by conditions on the ground, by measurable benchmarks regarding civilian protection and DGRR, and carried out in close consultation with the government. The A3 remain concerned about the impact of the United Nations liquidity crisis on the mission's ability to support national efforts in key areas, including the protection of civilians, the extension of state authority, and the implementation of the peace process. We therefore call on member states to meet their financial obligations in full and on time. To conclude, Madam President, the A3 reaffirm their full support for the Central African Republic and MINUSCA and urge them to resolutely pursue their efforts towards lasting peace and stability. We encourage the
to implement sanctions measures is also important. Sanctions, however, do not succeed or fail in a vacuum. They are most effective when applied as part of a comprehensive strategy to support political objectives set by the Council. Third, when Council resolution seeks to prevent or resolve disputes, their non-implementation risks not just short-term escalation, but also long-term enrichment of conflicts. Chapter 6 matters should be met by a proactive posture focused on dialogue, de-escalation, and trust building. Where a Chapter 6 resolution remains unimplemented, or where a dispute is formally brought to the Council's attention, the Council has a wide range of mechanisms at its disposal, including as foreseen in Articles 33 and 34 of the Charter. Many of these mechanisms have been underutilized and could be further explored in order to foster a more active Council role in the peaceful settlement of disputes. Council members have a special responsibility to seek avenues for continued dialogue, even and especially on the most difficult issues on its agenda. The good offices of the Secretary General, discharged through envoys and representatives, as well as other Secretariat officials, are an impartial vehicle to help forge common ground. The lesson for us is that we must take risks, even where implementation is difficult. As we know, there is a political value in the UN continuing to try, even where efforts are likely to fail. Being present and active allow us to identify possible entry points for advancing Council decisions. Excellencies, work underway in the Secretary General's UN 80 initiatives, Workstream 2, promises to strengthen mandate stewardship through stronger mandate discipline. Improved transparency and focus will certainly help better align and rely Secretariat and Member State efforts on mandate implementation, as long as accompanied by the requisite political will. Thank you.
Thank Mr. Kyari for his very informative briefing, and I now give the floor to Ms. Shamala Kandia Thompson, Executive Director of Security Council Report. You have the floor.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, thank you to the co-organizers for inviting me to participate in this discussion on strengthening the implementation of Security Council decisions. For just over 20 years, the Security Council report has closely followed and reported on the negotiation and adoption of resolutions. And these negotiations are often complex, politically demanding, and quite often highly contentious now. Yet following up on implementation has proven even more difficult. Our reporting suggests that the implementation gap is often most acute in situations where the Council repeatedly reaffirms core demands but is unable to secure compliance on the ground. And this issue is becoming even more relevant at a time when divisions within the Council have become more pronounced. In the past, it was relatively unusual for peacekeeping mandates, sanctions regimes, or thematic resolutions not to have the support of all Council members. Today, resolutions are increasingly adopted with abstentions and in some cases, significant unresolved disagreements. This raises an important question. Does the degree of political support behind a resolution affect the likelihood of implementation? Consensus is not a guarantee of implementation, and disagreement does not necessarily preclude it. But Council unity can help generate consistent messages, sustained engagement, and collective pressure on parties. This relationship between Council, peace and security resolutions. And our first speaker has covered a couple of these areas, but I'm going to look more specifically at certain aspects of it. So first, the peace operations. And this is one of the few areas where the Council's work where there is a relatively robust implementation architecture. The Council receives regular reports, hears periodic briefings, renews mandates, requests strategic reviews, adjusts mission priorities as circumstances evolve. Implementation is also subject to scrutiny by the General Assembly's Fifth Committee. And yet, implementation challenges persist. And good mandate design may be the starting point for addressing some of these challenges. Mandates need to be realistic, prioritized, and achievable. And the High-Level Panel on Peace Operations, or HIPPO, over 10 years ago now, this report highlighted that all of these things were needed. And some progress has been made since then. But the issue is even more relevant today in the context of budget constraints and competing demands. And in this context, at the design stage, greater attention could be paid to the costs of mandated activities. In addition, sustained engagement with stakeholders on the ground throughout the life cycle of a mission also helps to promote political backing of mandates. And it maximizes the chances of successful implementation and smoother transitions. Second, sanctions regimes. Sanctions are among the Council's most closely monitored tools. Committees, panels of experts, and regular reporting provide extensive information on violations and implementation challenges. So the problem is not a lack of information. Rather, it is inconsistent enforcement, limited capacity, and disagreements among member states regarding the objectives, effectiveness of sanctions. And the recent delays in appointing chairs and vice chairs of subsidiary bodies have highlighted another challenge. Implementation depends not only on the quality of mandates, but also on the ability of the structures supporting them to function effectively. Prolonged reduced inactivity can reduce opportunities for oversight, engagement, and follow-up. Council members should consider putting in place safeguards to reduce the impact of disruptions to the functioning of subsidiary bodies such as the sanctions committees and working groups. Then third, thematic resolutions. Over the past 2 decades, the Council has developed extensive normative frameworks on issues such as children and armed conflict, women, peace and security, and the protection of civilians. The Children and Armed Conflict Agenda demonstrates the value of effective follow-up mechanisms. Through its monitoring and reporting mechanism, the Secretary General's annual reports, the listing process, and the Working Group on Children and Armed Conflict, the Council has established one of its most developed implementation frameworks. These tools have not completely eliminated violations, however, although they have helped to sustain Council attention, identify gaps, and contribute to concrete outcomes, including the release of more than 220,000 children in the past 3 decades. However, a well-developed framework is not enough. A recent SAR research report on protection of civilians highlights the gap that can emerge between normative commitments and realities on the ground. Monitoring mechanisms matter, but they cannot substitute for political will. The lesson is not that monitoring guarantees implementation, but that implementation is difficult to assess and even more difficult to advance in the absence of dedicated follow-up mechanisms. And finally, the crisis response resolutions that the Council adopts. In situations of acute crisis, the Council has adopted resolutions calling for ceasefires, humanitarian access, or the protection of civilians. And yet these resolutions are rarely accompanied by dedicated arrangements for monitoring the implementation or responding to non-compliance. Recent resolutions on Gaza and Ukraine, for example, illustrate the challenge. And future crisis response type resolutions could benefit from clearer follow-up provisions, including requests for timely reporting and on implementation or on options for Council consideration. And this brings me to my final point, which is on the relationship between reporting and implementation. As you've heard, the Council already receives a lot of information. So the challenge is not in the absence of information, but it's whether the information helps the Council assess implementation and determine what action is required. More focused and strategic reporting could help to bridge the gap. Perhaps rather than attempting to cover every development, reports could focus more directly on progress against mandate objectives, obstacles to implementation, and feasible options for Council action. Equally important is consistent Council follow-up. Mandate renewals, strategic reviews, sanctions committee meetings, consultations, informal interactive dialogues, and ARIA formula meetings like this one. They are all opportunities to assess implementation and consider adjustments when necessary. Many of these improvements could most likely be achieved without significant additional resources. And ultimately, the effectiveness of the Council should be measured not only by the resolutions it adopts, but by the extent to which these resolutions are implemented and achieve their intended objectives. Implementation needs to be viewed not as a discrete event, but as a continuous process requiring sustained attention, oversight, and political commitment. I thank you.